All right, welcome back in here to Live and Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. Of course, we're following the latest as American astronaut Jim Lovell, the commander of the 1970 mission Apollo 13, died earlier this week at the age of 97, NASA said on Friday. Of course, known for that mission that was catastrophic but made successful in their return. The three-man crew returning to Earth. Hollywood superstar Tom Hanks reprised that role in Hollywood. For more on this, let's take you out to this story to talk about the life and legacy of Jim Lovell.
Houston, we've had a problem.
All the training and rehearsing for Apollo 13 could not have prepared Commander Jim Lovell for the events that would await him and his crew in space.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing.
He was born in Cleveland on March 25th, 1928. Walking on the moon was Jim Lovell's lifelong dream. He began pursuing it by learning to fly an airplane. Around this time, Jim was accepted to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. While there, he wrote his senior thesis on the then unheard-of topic of liquid fuel rocketry.
I can recall quite vividly when John Glenn first went into space back in February of 1962, and I was sort of envious that I wasn't also in the program.
Navy Captain Lovell finally got his chance. NASA selected him to be an astronaut. In 1965, Lovell and Frank Borman were launched into space for 14 days on the history-making Gemini 7 mission.
We had some 21 medical experiments, and basically to find out if man could live in space for 2 weeks.
After that, he commanded Gemini 12, along with co-pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. Lovell then went on as command module pilot and navigator on America's maiden voyage to the moon, Apollo 8. On this mission, the U.S. finally won the space race against the communist Soviet Union.
Apollo 8 was also a very unique flight, not just because it was the first time man had left the confines of the Earth and orbited another body, but we did it right around Christmas Eve in 1968.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
We read from the Old Testament, the first 10 verses of Genesis, which is the basis of many of the world's religions.
Lovell marked his fourth and final trip into space as commander of the now historic Apollo 13 flight in April 1970. 2 days into the mission, an explosion in the oxygen tank caused the abrupt cancellation of plans for a lunar landing.
We heard this sort of a thump or a noise, and lights started to come on, and I looked up at Fred, and I knew that he didn't know what caused it. And of course, then I looked over at Jack, and Jack's eyes were as wide as saucers, and he obviously didn't know what happened either.
The world held its breath. People were riveted to television screens as the planned third landing on the moon turned into a human drama of survival for the three-man team.
It was a triumph in human energy and human ability to take an almost complete certain catastrophe and make it a successful recovery.
Lovell would become the first man to journey twice to the moon, never leaving his footprints on its surface. But Apollo 13 proved to be Captain Jim Lovell's finest moment as an astronaut.
Odyssey, Houston, we show you on the main.
Poised and collected, he led his crew back safely home to Earth on April 17th, 1970.
I had the crew on the water, and we were safe, and the swimmers came over and knocked on the window. Then I knew that we were home.
After retiring from the Navy and the space program in 1973, Captain Lovell became a successful businessman. He also served on several charitable boards, such as the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum.
I look back on my own life, and I guess I was really lucky. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time with the right set of credentials. And here I am.
John Scott, Fox News.
All right, thank you so much. And talking about that, what an inspiring story. You can only imagine what was going through his head in that moment back in 1970. You also can imagine what that moment might look like in this day and age. We do have this statement coming in from the family talking about the loss of Jim Lovell, from his family saying, "We are saddened to announce the passing of our beloved father, USN Captain James Jim Lovell, a Navy pilot and officer, astronaut leader, and space explorer. He was 97. We are enormously proud of his amazing life and career accomplishments, highlighted by his legendary leadership in pioneering human spaceflight. But to all of us, he was dad, granddad, and the leader of the family. Most importantly, he was our hero. We will miss his unshakable optimism, his sense of humor, and the way he made each of us feel we could do the impossible. He was truly one of a kind. Let's bring into the conversation right now Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony, the curator of the Apollo Collection at the National Smithsonian Museum, the Air and Space Museum. So very fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, we're talking about Jim Lovell. What comes to mind when you hear that name? What do you think of?
Jim Lovell was just an exceptional person all around. He was one of these people that you just felt lucky to have met him or spent some time in his orbit. I had the privilege of getting to work with him over the past 15 years and always felt so grateful for that time we had together. So he was an exceptional astronaut, as everyone knows, an exceptional pilot, graduated first in the test pilot school. But he was also just a wonderful human being, so kind, so generous with his time, spent a lot of effort, sharing his enthusiasm for space and helping inspire kids to get into space exploration.
Yeah, and of course, Apollo 13, he will be forever known for that moment. Of course, they're calling it a failed mission, but to come back to Earth, back to home after being stranded so far away there on their way there. How does the Smithsonian tell that story? And if someone was to go to the Smithsonian to learn about Jim, to learn about the Apollo 13, how do you dictate that story?
We have an exhibit called Destination Moon, and it explores lunar exploration throughout time. And in that exhibit, there's a section that looks at the impact of mission control. And this is a great time to tell the story of Apollo 13 because the astronauts worked so closely with mission control to ensure that they would come home safely. So we have a handful of artifacts there from the mission on display, and you can learn about that story of that mission, about Jim Lovell, and what it took for them to return safely back to Earth.
Yeah, and there's just so many artifacts at the Smithsonian to detail. Scrolling through the webpage earlier on today, you have the command module right there, and that's the thing that was not necessarily designed to come back to Earth. It was just kind of the makeshift way that they were able to safely return to adapt to that moment. How is that maintained, and how special of an artifact is that to you?
Well, so at the museum in Washington, D.C., we have the Apollo 11 command module from a different mission. But part of my collection also includes the Apollo 13 command module, but that's on display in Kansas. So if you're interested in seeing that, you can see it firsthand at the Kansas Cosmosphere. So we have a very robust lending program, and we make sure that our spacecraft are across the country. So if you want to see the one from Apollo 13, you have to visit Kansas, but they're doing a wonderful job of keeping it safe and well and exciting visitors with that story.
That's so very exciting. All right, I didn't know that. All right, well, that's kind of interesting. What other artifacts are there? Is the kind of the makeshift breathing apparatus? Because as they heard kind of that loud bang happen when they're in space, is that there?
Yes, that is exactly. So we were able to work with the people in mission control that came up with the contraption, and they put one together for us. So you can see what it took to create this contraption in space to allow the astronauts to breathe much longer and to come home safely. And during the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13, I did this wonderful event with Jim Lovell, and it was so funny because he had such good humor about it. All the live events had to be canceled because it was right at the beginning of COVID, and we were still trying to figure out how to use Zoom, and so it was a bit of a debacle. But he had such a good humor about it, and he talked about he would have liked to bring that home, but they needed it installed in the ship as long as possible so that they could breathe safely before they entered the command module and returned back to Earth.
That is so fun to see him have so much humor. It's also kind of just showcases how much technology has changed, that this man that was able to lead that crew of 3 through all of these circumstances and the Zoom problems that even I have, even youngsters have as well. Anything else that kind of stands out in terms of the artifacts that you have there at the National Smithsonian?
We have the the parachutes from the mission. So part of what, coming safely back home involves the parachute system. We also have the vest from Gene Kranz, who was head of mission control at the time. And so Apollo 13 really is a story of an incredible team effort, everyone coming together to solve these extraordinary challenges under really stressful conditions. And so we're able to tell that story of people like Gene Kranz, who worked around the clock with his team as the astronauts were working themselves within the spacecraft and dealing with really challenging conditions. So they had to reduce their water intake so much that they had less than a cup of water a day because they needed that water for the spacecraft systems. I mean, it was a really quite harrowing experience, but they were extraordinarily well trained. They worked together as a crew. They worked together with mission control and returned safely home. So there are a few artifacts that help us tell that story. There's also incredible artifacts at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. I have to point that out as well. So if you're in Chicago, go visit. I used to work there, and I got to work with Jim Lovell as he donated his artifacts to the Adler. And he kept an incredible collection, but he wanted to share it with the world, and he wanted to share his story. So there are many places that you can see some of his artifacts from those missions.
That's so very cool. Kansas, Chicago, a little bit of everything. Jim Lovell everywhere for that. I do want to ask you, because as I was scrolling, there's artifacts like a signed dollar bill, potentially at the Smithsonian. There's just duct tape. How unusual, how wild are the artifacts? Because it's something like you wouldn't kind of imagine there.
There's a huge range. It's it's small things like toothbrushes to the spacecraft itself. And I always joke that when people ask what lessons should we learn from Apollo, we should always bring duct tape on those missions because it saved the day with Apollo 13 doing that lithium hydroxide mock-up, and then it also was very useful in other missions like Apollo 17.
Yeah, astronauts and my dad in the garage certainly appreciate the utility of duct tape. Is there anything, what's the most common question you get about Jim, about Apollo 13 when you're at the Smithsonian? Is there something commonality that people are most curious about?
Well, people often ask if the movie is accurate, and I have to say it is one of my all-time favorite movies, definitely on top for space movies, and it is incredibly accurate. And I talked to him about the accuracy, and he said they only got one thing wrong, which is the slight angle of the trajectory at re-entry. I mean, it's quite remarkable. But I will say, I recommend reading his book because the amount of challenges that they had to face on that mission even exceeded what you see in that film. The film is so well done. But they encountered so many problems, it would have made the film too long. So I definitely recommend watching it. But most people think, could this really be true? Could he have really had to endure that kind of mission? And yes, the answer is yes.
And I got to say, I think the most iconic line, I think the line that everyone talks about is the Houston, we have a problem. That was not exactly verbatim, and it also wasn't said by Jim. Is that correct?
That is correct. So after they heard the first sound of the oxygen tank exploding, his colleague, Jack Swigert, another astronaut on the mission, he said, "Houston, we've had a problem," I believe is the correct phrasing. So very, very close. I think it's Houston, we've had a problem here. But it was clear from the very start there was an issue, and so people started working right away on that solution.
And of course, talking to Houston, and you come back kind of that to mission control and how important they were in all of this. And I do want to put up just this post here on Live Now from Fox is Tom Hanks saying a tribute to Jim Lovell, of course, playing that in the iconic movie Apollo 13, saying there are people who dare to dream and who lead to the places we would not go on our own. Jim Lovell, who for a long time had gone further into space and for longer than any other person on our planet, was that kind of guy. His voyages around the Earth and on to so very close to the moon were not made for riches or celebrity, but because such challenges are what fuels the course of being alive, and who better than Jim Lovell to make those voyages. On this night of full moon, he passes on to the heavens, to the cosmos, to the stars. Godspeed you on the next voyage, Jim Lovell. And of course, it's funny we talk about this because he was asked about the casting of Tom Hanks in Apollo 13. And I believe that he wanted Kevin Costner instead. Did you ever get to meet Tom Hanks? Was there any kind of moment there between Jim and Tom that you got to witness?
I didn't, unfortunately, but I do know that they stayed close. And Jim Lovell's responsible for designing the emblems, the mission patches from Apollo 13 and Apollo 8. And they saw this wonderful painting that inspired them to ask an artist to see if they could create a patch based on that painting. And years later, when it was up for auction, Tom Hanks ended up getting it for Jim Lovell as a present, and that traveled with Lovell to his retirement community as well, which is just such a beautiful gesture, I think, and a sign of their friendship.
Yeah, that is so very true. And what a special moment it is for those two individuals, obviously the top of their craft in both acting and as an astronaut as well. Is there anything else prior to Apollo 13? Because we talk about Jim Lovell being so iconic for Apollo 13, but he was a part of previous space programs, never was able to set foot on the moon, but his time in space, one time the longest man that's been in space. Is there any other artifacts that showcase who Jim was and what he did for the space program?
He talked a lot about how spaceflight could bring people together, and he, I think, was very proud of how he contributed to the sense of uniting people, and that really happened with the Apollo 8 mission. So this was the first mission to orbit the moon, the first time humans had gone to the vicinity of the moon. It was a terribly risky mission. The US CIA picked up information that the Soviet Union might be going to the moon soon, so they sort of leapfrogged ahead, and Jim Lovell, along with Frank Borman and Bill Anders, orbited the moon at the end of 1968. And they were told, more people will be listening to what you say as you orbit the moon in this live broadcast than have listened to any human voice in the history of mankind. So that they should say something appropriate. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up reading the first passage of Genesis. And they thought that was going to be a great reflection of humanity, that this was an accomplishment for all humankind. And that passage really reflects that. And so they did, and they did speak to more people than had ever heard another human voice, and it really gave people a sense of, humanity, shared experience. And he brought that script home. It was printed out in the flight plan, and that's now on display at the Adler Planetarium. It's in their collection, but just an extraordinary artifact that really represents how he saw spaceflight as something much greater than himself, and something really worthy of all the hard work and the challenge.
Yeah, to share it with everyone. Must have been so proud to be able to do that, and obviously keeping it clean for all the kids that might have been out there tuning in as well. I want to ask, because we're having some of these images, and obviously this probably isn't the exact time that he was up there, but there's that iconic image of really the Earth with the moon in the foreground. Can you talk about some of the imagery that you'll see at the Smithsonian to showcase their journey, but also just the perspective, because that is something that people didn't have a chance to back in the 70s when Apollo 13, during the Apollo 70 program. Can you talk about the imagery and some of the photographs that might be seen there?
Yeah, exactly. So in Apollo 8, they took the Earthrise image, which is one of the most reproduced famous images of all time. Bill Anders took that image, and we have the camera from that mission, the one that was used to take Earthrise, in our collection. And Lovell also took a number of pictures very similar to Earthrise, but it's wonderful to hear the audio of them as they see the Earth rising above the horizon of the moon, and they get so excited and they make sure they need to capture it. I should also mention that we have the Gemini 7 spacecraft from Jim Lovell's earlier mission as well. So if you want to see one of his spacecrafts and you're in Washington, you can see that one on display.
That's so very cool. And I think during one of those moments, they're talking about how they need to get the color photography, and that also showcases how the technology has changed, that they didn't want a black and white photo. They wanted to showcase it in true color, the blues of the oceans kind of shining back in the cosmos. Before I let you go, anything else? We could talk about this all day. It's so very fascinating. Anything else in terms of Jim, in terms of Apollo 13 that you want to let us know?
Well, I think one wonderful thing about Jim Lovell is his determination, and that he did not give up. And I think sometimes when you see someone who is so successful, and so talented. It makes sense that they're so successful, but he worked really hard and encountered a number of challenges over time. So when he first applied to be an astronaut, he was rejected, but he tried again. There's an incredible story when he was doing his first night flight and landing on an aircraft carrier, and he almost didn't make it, and he had to find the trail from the bioluminescence that the aircraft carrier was churning up behind it. But his life is example after example after example of overcoming difficult situations and sort of keeping focused at his higher goals. And so for me, I'm always just so inspired by how he never let anything prevent him from achieving what he wanted to achieve.
Yeah, and the perseverance there, especially Apollo 13 as well, just the amount of challenges that were put in front of him. Before I let you go, do you think he had any regrets because he wasn't able to step foot on the moon? He was going to be able to get a chance to do that in Apollo 13. He never returned to space to accomplish kind of that goal that so few people have had the chance to do. Do you think he ever regretted that? Do you think that ever weighed on him at all?
I don't know for sure. I do know that since he was a young child, he dreamed about spaceflight when it was still in the realm of science fiction, and he worked his entire life to get there. I also know that Lovell and many of the Apollo astronauts express how lucky they feel that they were born at that right moment. They had those right experiences that they could join the astronaut corps. All those early astronauts, you know, they're all within a few years of each other of when they were born, and they recognize how lucky that was to be alive at that time and to be in that position where they could travel to the moon. So even though he wasn't able to land, I know he was really grateful for those experiences to see the moon up close twice.
For you, just on a personal note, before I let you go, because we talk about Apollo 13, the movie came out, really reignited or retold that story that was so infamous for what Jim Lovell and the other astronauts did on that. We've seen Artemis recently as they're kind of trying to revamp it. Do we see spikes in popularity? Do we see spikes in people interested in space coming to the Smithsonian, eager to learn about space and going to the moon, visiting the cosmos? Do we see different spikes and moments like that really reignite just this passion for space?
I know that when the Apollo 13 film originally came out 30 years ago, it did ignite a lot of excitement. And I think these new Artemis missions are doing the same. I'll mention that Apollo 13, the film, will be re-released in September, I believe on IMAX screens across the country. So you'll get an opportunity to see that on a big screen again. So the timing's sort of remarkable. But there are all different ways that people get excited and inspired about spaceflight. It is one of these areas that has sort of captured the imagination through decades, and it has lasting sort of impact and inspiration for people. So although there are sort of changes over time, I think for the most part, it is something that continues to excite people.
All right, in case I visit the Smithsonian soon, if you're walking in the doors of the National Air and Space Smithsonian, where do we go first?
So I would say stop at the lunar module. I'm the curator of the Apollo Collection, so I'm extremely biased, and I would send you right to Destination Moon to learn about lunar exploration and to learn about those stories. But we have many new galleries that have opened just over the past few years, so there's lots to explore.
The amount of artifacts, the amount of knowledge that you can gain from being there is obviously untold. Thank you so much, Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony. I appreciate your time here on LiveNOW from Vox. Great conversation.
Thank you.